A rainy night on Good Friday seems appropriate as we gather. I notice throughout my career as a pastor the difference between the crowds that will be here on Sunday morning or were here last Sunday for Palm Sunday and the crowd of us who gather on Good Friday, which also seems appropriate. So we think about how few folks were there around the tomb. I don't know about you, but when I picture Good Friday, I always have like this, image of three crosses up on a hill by themselves with not much of anybody around. Maybe those pictures we've seen of Mary on one side and John, the beloved disciple, on the other. I put a different picture in your bulletin on the second page there. And what I like about that, if you look at it, is the size of the crowd that's gathered around the cross there. Because we tend to think of this as a lonely, isolated thing. But this would have been a public spectacle as Jesus was executed outside the city walls in Jerusalem. We think of it, much the same way we think of executions today, right? When there's an execution by the state of Texas today, it happens inside a prison with maybe a small group of family and lawyers watching, but nobody else. Everybody else is outside, far away. And this would not have been like that. The point of the execution was to send a message. The point of crucifixion was to send a message. Anybody else who thought that they, like Jesus, might consider themselves king of the Jews would face a similar fate. And so they would go outside the city of Jerusalem on the main road where everybody walking in and out would see it. And that's where the execution would happen. Story is told about other famous crucifixions in Roman history. And the one that comes to mind is the slave revolution under Spartacus. Right? You may remember that old movie, Spartacus, right? I Am Spartacus. Okay. So it was an actual execution that happened, an actual slave revolt that happened. And for dozens, 100 miles, going in and out of Rome on the Appian Way, the Roman authorities lined the road with slaves crucified as a reminder to anybody else who might challenge the authority of Rome. So think of it less as those sterile executions in the way that we have them now. Think of it more like the lynchings you might have read about or heard about that we used to have, that we still sometimes have in this country. Think about it if you go and you read about one of the famous lynchings in Montgomery County. The lynching took place on the courthouse lawn, and you can find postcards of it. Pictures that ran in the newspaper with hundreds gathered on the courthouse lawn to watch as they executed a black man in Conroe. It wasn't a private event, it was a public spectacle meant to send a message. Rome, the religious authorities, the civil authorities, intended to send a message with the execution of Jesus. Stay in your place. Remember who's in charge. Forget this man and his message unless you have dreams of a similar fate for yourselves. And sure enough, right, of the disciples, we know a number of them themselves faced crucifixion and execution for continuing to proclaim the message of Jesus. Good Friday, that first Good Friday, was intended as a message in the same way that public violence is always intended as a message to inspire fear. The amazing thing is not that an innocent man was executed. The amazing thing is not that there is violence and hatred that snuffed out a life on that day. The amazing thing is that Good Friday has continued to be used to proclaim a message, but it is the exact opposite of the message that was intended. Now, Good Friday has been used a lot of ways and proclaimed a lot of ways, right? And sometimes the things that we hear on Good Friday is, you know, you all ought to feel real bad about yourselves because look what you did to Jesus. Because you're, basically a bad person. And you should feel bad on this day. God needed to kill Jesus. Because of you. Wow, that's a lot. I grew up with messages like that. I'm not saying you should always feel good, but let me be clear. The God of Scripture did not require the death of Jesus or anyone else. Jesus was not crucified by God. Jesus was not whipped by God. Jesus was a victim of violence undertaken at human hands. Jesus was a victim of what hatred looks like when hatred has power and authority. And it's still what hatred looks like in public today. God didn't need anyone to die. Rome needed someone to die that day. The good religious folks of Jerusalem needed someone to die that day. What if it's not a question that God needed the death of Jesus, but humanity needed the death of Jesus? Because we often put to death things that are lovely and beautiful and call us to account for our hatred of others. What if Good Friday is not some abusive God meting out punishment on Jesus on behalf of humankind, but rather, the words of Nadia Bolz-Weber, what if Good Friday is the story about how God would rather die than be in the business of counting sins anymore? What if the story of Good Friday is the story of how God would rather go to the cross than meet violence with more violence? What if Good Friday is the story about how God would rather choose love, even if it costs God everything, than respond to hatred with hatred? What a different story that is. Good Friday is not the story of a bloodthirsty God. Good Friday is how Jesus shows us that there is another way. That human stories almost always get wrapped up in hate and pride and retribution, that we almost always strive to meet power with power and hatred with hatred and violence with violence. How many school shootings this year? Remember, when I was in high school, I graduated a couple years ago. Toward the end of my time in high school, we first began to have a resource officer, a police officer in our school, who was there part-time, who showed up a couple of days of the week. How many officers are there on Conroe ISD now? Our response to violence are more tools of violence. We respond to gun violence with more guns. That's how we answer every problem like this. How do we respond to a nation invading another nation? More bombs, more guns. The human way, our way, is to meet hatred with more hatred, to meet anger by getting even angrier, to meet violence with even more violence. And we wonder why it never works. The way of the cross, the story of Good Friday, is a story about meeting hatred with love. A story about meeting the power of the empires of this world, the violence of the empires of this world, with peace and love. The story of Good Friday was meant to be a story to inspire fear in anyone who might take up the message of Jesus. Instead, the cross of Christ, the way of the cross, the story of Good Friday, is an inspiration to countless generations to beat our swords into plowshares, to learn about war no more, to humble ourselves in the way that Jesus emptied himself, to meet the empires of this world, the violence of this world, the anger of this world, and the hatred of this world with love. Always with love.